Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
Want to thank Dr. Gary Ostrower for coming on today instead of Tuesday. Steuben County Democrat Chair Sean Hogan had asked for equal time, so we got him on the next day after Republican County Chair Joseph Belinsky had come on the day before to talk about the list of candidates. So welcoming now Dr. Ostrower. Thanks for joining us here on a Thursday, Gary.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here on a Thursday, on a night after the Washington Nationals have won the World Series.
Yes, your thoughts?
Well, it was, I thought, a very, very interesting series. First of all, I think that many of our listeners, if they are baseball fans, probably know that this is the first time that the Washington team, any team from Washington in baseball, has won a World Series since 1924. So, it's been roughly over, almost 100 years before Washington has seen a championship team, at least in baseball. The Senators were there until many years. I believe, I may be wrong, but I think it was until about 1969 or 1970 when the Senators then departed. They went to, I think, Minnesota, and then eventually someplace else. I can't even remember. And then finally, when the Montreal Expos folded in Montreal, the Montreal team moved to Washington, and so Washington has been struggling ever since. But it was really a great World Series, I thought, a really entertaining World Series. And one of the things that I find most kind of interesting about this is that all the games that were won, the 4 games that were won by Washington over Houston, the 3 games that Houston won over Washington, were all won, I should say, in the other team's ballpark. In other words, it was no home games were actually won by the two teams. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that's the first time that no home games were won, not only in a baseball World Series, but in any professional World Series, whether we're talking about football or, not so much football, but certainly basketball and so forth, over the course of, I think, the entire history of professional sports in the United States. That's kind of an oddity, and yet the home teams were not winning games this time. But yesterday's game was a really, really interesting game. The Houston pitcher, his name is Zinke, had pitched exceedingly well. I think was throwing a one-hitter into the 7th inning, and then things fell apart for Houston, and Washington kind of clawed back. They came back as they came back over the course of the entire season to eventually win the World Series. It was a very, very entertaining series, a very entertaining game last night. And Brian, the one other thing I might mention about last night is that Alfred University's basketball team that's a Division III basketball team, played St. Bonaventure, a Division I basketball team. They played what I guess you would call an exhibition game. It was played at the Riley Center at St. Bonaventure, and it wasn't quite as entertaining. I don't know what the final score was, but St. Bonaventure scored approximately 75 points, and Alfred scored about 45 points. So it was, I guess, what we would normally call a blowout, but it was still kind of entertaining to see Alfred playing against a team that kind of outdid it in respect to height at just about every single position. The St. Bonaventure guards were taller than the Alfred University forwards, or at least some of them were, and this kind of kicks off the next. Really kicks off the basketball season, not only for Alfred and for St. Bonaventure, but nationally.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower, who works at both Alfred University and at St. Bonaventure. And Dr. Ostrower was looking up on the news pages what time the House vote is going to be today. And I see USA Today says the lawmakers have not specified what time the resolution is going to be discussed today. So we'll just have to keep a close eye on that. Your thoughts on the current situation in Washington? I know that Congressman Tom Reed has spoken against it. House Speaker Pelosi. Some people seem to think that Schiff is kind of in line with what Pelosi wants, although Pelosi publicly does not necessarily seem to be on the same page as Schiff. Your thoughts?
Well, Adam Schiff is a congressman from California. He is the head of the investigation in the House of Representatives in the Intelligence Committee, and he is a very, very smart, a very, very independent kind of guy. He has conducted, I think, an extremely effective investigation, more so than the Judiciary Committee, which is headed by Jerry Nadler from New York. Is he simply a tool of Pelosi? Certainly not. Nancy Pelosi was dragging her feet on a impeachment investigation for a long, long time, while people like Schiff were arguing that the facts of the matter demand a impeachment investigation. And so Pelosi eventually fell into line. So rather than Schiff following Pelosi, I think it's really the other way around. Secondly, what we've learned in the last 5 weeks, especially really in the last 2 weeks or so, is that there was a whistleblower, okay, and President Trump has claimed that the so-called whistleblower who claimed that President Trump was seeking a quid pro quo from Ukraine. In other words, that Ukraine would investigate Senator Biden and Biden's son, in return for which the administration would turn over about $400 million of military aid to the Ukraine, which Ukraine desperately needs because they're involved in a shooting war with the Russians. President Trump claimed that the whistleblower was wrong, that in fact Trump had not done anything wrong. He claimed that the whistleblower was a Democratic operative, that the whistleblower, in other words, was in many ways, it was a partisan attack. But of course, Trump didn't really know who the whistleblower was, and all the allegations about the whistleblower were really phony, precisely because we still don't know to this day who the whistleblower is, and that includes that President Trump does not know who it is. More importantly, the facts of the case having to do with this quid pro quo have been verified by a number of very, very outstanding civil servants, including the ambassador, a former ambassador to the Ukraine by the name of William Taylor, a man who has spent many, many years, decades, in the Foreign Service, and then most recently by a fellow of the name of Vitamin. He's a lieutenant colonel in the Army. He has served in a distinguished fashion in Iraq. He was wounded. He received a Purple Heart in Iraq. He is a career Army officer. And while Trump and his friends are trying to diminish, or trying to insult, or trying to question his integrity and so forth, one of Trump's defenders on Fox News, a man by the name of John Woo, who is a lawyer, even claimed that this colonel, his name is Vindman, Colonel Vindman, was involved in espionage, was involved in spying against the United States, was, in other words, committing treason. But he was doing anything but committing treason. What he was essentially saying is that the phone call between President Trump and the president of Ukraine did indeed involve a quid pro quo. And when the President of the United States had his people in the White House try to remove that section from the transcript of this telephone call that dealt with the quid pro quo, Colonel Vindman attempted to replace it, to get it back into the transcript because that was included in the actual phone call, and he was rebuffed. So the transcript itself was apparently, they monkeyed around with the transcript. They altered the transcript as a way of protecting the president, and then took the transcript and placed it into a very, very secure computer server that would not be available to the Congress, that would not be available to the press, that would not be available to anyone else. In other words, President Trump has a lot to hide. And the impeachment inquiry is showing increasingly, again and again, week after week, month after month, that, in fact, the president did commit impeachable crimes.
Talking to our regular Tuesday guest here on a Thursday, Alfred University history professor, Dr. Gary Ostrower. Now, when I was saying that some of the Republicans are saying that Congressman Adam Schiff is kind of a puppet of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, I think that sentiment comes from the Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana wing of the party. He also made a statement saying that Pelosi and Schiff are dragging this thing out so that it will help the Democrats. in the presidential race. TheHill.com disagreed with that and said that any impeachment trial would be a headache in the presidential race for Senator Warren or Senator Sanders or Kamala Harris, Amy Klobuchar, Cory Booker, et cetera, et cetera. Your thoughts on what TheHill.com is saying and what Senator Kennedy says, Dr. Ostrower?
I think Hill.com is correct. The Democrats are not trying to drag this out. Quite the contrary, they're trying to speed it up. And they want to speed it up because they want it out of the way as soon as they can. Now, whether they'll get it out of the way by Christmas time, by Thanksgiving, we do not know. We're almost into November, of course. My guess is that it's going to continue through, probably the end of December. Every single week we discover that there is more there. There are more people who are involved in attempting to cover up what the president has done. I find one of the interesting things that President Trump has said, he's tweeted, of course, many, many different things about this, including the fact that, yes, it's a witch hunt and so forth. But, he's also said that it's unconstitutional, that what the Democrats are doing is unconstitutional. The only way that the president can claim that this is unconstitutional is if he has never read the Constitution. And I think there's reason to believe that he has not read the Constitution. I mean, you've heard me say before on this program that he claims that, we have to protect Article number 12. Well, there is no Article number 12 in the Constitution. And there's certainly, the amendment number 12 has nothing to do with this whatsoever. The fact of the matter is that the president has committed actions which certainly deserve investigation and that probably are, in fact, the basis for an impeachable crime. Now, it's entirely possible that the Republicans will simply, especially in the Senate, not convict him. But if that's the case, they do so not so for judicial reasons, but rather for political reasons, to protect him. Is this process unconstitutional, as he says? Read the Constitution. Read Article number 1 of the Constitution and read Article number 2 of the Constitution, which outline with clarity why there might be an impeachment proceeding. If the president has violated his oath of office, if the president has undermined the national interests of the United States, if the president has in fact committed obstruction of justice, if the president has in fact invited a foreign country, in this case the Ukraine, to interfere in the American election, those are impeachable crimes. Those are what we call high crimes and misdemeanors, in which case there's every good reason for the House of Representatives to vote for articles of impeachment, and the Senate should, if these folks in the Senate have integrity, they should, almost certainly, convict the president if, in fact, the evidence which will be presented before them suggests that, yes, he's guilty of those crimes.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower. I'm going to take a quick break, then check the weather. We'll be back with Dr. Ostrower in just a moment.
Here's Tony Romo for Skechers Slip-On Footwear.
Now that I've hung up the cleats, I like to wear a more comfortable shoe. In fact, I like to wear the most comfortable shoe. Skechers Slip-Ons. Skechers Slip-Ons are simply the best. For one thing, there's no laces, so they just slip right on. Then there's the Skechers Air-Cooled Memory Foam. It cradles your feet and provides unbelievable comfort that lasts all day long. Skechers Slip-Ons are the most comfortable, easy-to-wear shoes I've ever worn.
Try Skechers Slip-Ons with air-cooled memory foam today. Skechers, comfort included.
There's nothing like meeting face-to-face, and there's nothing like Zoom to make that happen. Zoom lets you connect and do business across town or around the world. Zoom ties together all of your communication needs into one easy platform for video conferencing, phone calls, group chat, webinars, and your conference rooms. Connect easily from anywhere, your mobile phone, your laptop, or conference room. Zoom is how business gets done. Get your free account at Zoom.com today. Meet happy with Zoom.
Checking in with the meteorologist, Rob Carolyn, who says windy tomorrow.
That's right. Who's skipping down the streets of the city, smiling at everybody she sees? Everybody knows her name is Windy. And that's right, Brian. It is
wow, that's
quite
going back.
It is back to the 60s with the association. But quite fitting with the windy weather we've got coming up for the trick-or-treaters, Brian. They're certainly going to have to be careful this evening. If you're out on the roads this evening and it's during trick-or-treat time, be careful because the visibility is not going to be the best with the wind and the rain and all sorts of stuff blowing around. Be careful. National Weather Service has put a wind advisory up for the area. That's in effect for Friday from 4 a.m. through 6 p.m. To our west, it is a high wind warning, which means they'll probably see gusts over 50 miles an hour. Out to our west, we'll see gusts over 40 miles an hour. Today, we'll see occasional rain coming up ahead of the front. It's breezy, it's mild, 65 to 70. Sunrise earlier was at 7:43. The sun sets tonight at 6:05. Tonight, front goes by. The rain ends during the evening. Winds pick up. It's very blustery overnight. Temperatures will fall back to 40. Now, tomorrow, we'll see clouds and a few peaks of sun. Breezy with the chance of a shower. Highs only near 50. Partly cloudy, diminishing winds tomorrow night, 30 to 35. Brian, a look ahead to Saturday has us partly sunny near 50, or partly sunny and 45 to 50 on Sunday.
Thank you, Rob. Back to Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, are you set to move on to this day in history yet?
I'm quite ready.
Okay, it's October 31st, 1776. King George addressed the whole United States independence issue.
Yeah, this is the first time that the king had publicly addressed the fact that the Americans had declared independence. We had a declaration that was passed by what was called at that time the Continental Congress in June of 1776. On July 4th, of course, the Declaration of Independence was more or less publicized, and then it would be signed by some people on July 4th, but by many other signers over the course of the next 3 months or so. And so you had this revolutionary process. And I want to, if I can, just provide a little bit of chronological clarity here. The Revolutionary War began in April of 1775. But in April of 1775, very, very few Americans were thinking in terms of actual independence. What they wanted was for the king to recognize that the colonial assemblies on this side of the Atlantic had essentially the same power as Parliament on the other side of the Atlantic. Nevertheless, most Americans, most colonists still assumed and still supported the idea that we were very much part of the British Empire. And within yet a relatively short period of time, really only 15 months, we are going to move from a demand, if you will, for what we would call home rule to a demand for actual independence, where the colonies become the United States of America. That's a very, very important shift over, as I say, a relatively short period of time. The king was, of course, in the Declaration of Independence, accused of many, many different crimes. He had suspended our colonial assemblies. He had called these assemblies to order in areas where it was difficult to reach, and so forth. But in the meantime, what he had also done is something else, and that is that he had used German troops, Hessian troops they were called, German troops against his American cousins. And that was very, very galling to Americans. It's one of the things that led so many of the colonists to believe that we really did need independence. And in addition to that, I want to note that, historians have often claimed that it was the British Prime Minister, a man by the name of Lord North, who was really the hardliner, the guy who refused to compromise on the British side. The fact of the matter is that it was also the king. I think we have underestimated the degree to which King George III had actual control, if you will, had, kind of a real day-to-day direction over much of what the British were going to do during this period in 1775 and 1776, and even through the remainder of the Revolutionary War, which finally ended the final major battle in October of 1781. King George was a hardliner. King George was very, very smart. He was really very, very capable, much more so, I think, than many Americans have realized. But by the same token, he was uncompromising. And when you're unwilling to compromise, you're going to wind up often in civil wars, which is, in a sense, what the Revolutionary War began as. and then, of course, eventuating in American independence. Had King George been a little bit more willing to compromise, had he been somewhat more flexible, and had he been more willing to view the situation from the American perspective, at least to sympathize with what the Americans were saying, I think that he probably would not, he wouldn't have lost those 13 colonies. We probably have a status today similar to what the Canadians have within the context of the British system.
Now, moving back to 1517, it was on this day in history that Martin Luther posted the 95 Theses. I find it interesting that was handwritten, but then it was typed out on the original first printing presses, I believe, to get mass copies out to the public in Germany.
Well, I don't know about the first printing press. The printing press, as we understand it, that we understand, was first produced by Johann Gutenberg in the year 1485. So it's approximately 32 years or so before Luther is going to tack his so-called 95 Theses to that door in Wittenberg, Germany, in other words, to the door of the cathedral. And when Luther did that, it really begins what historians commonly call the Reformation, sometimes called sometimes called the Reformation. The Catholics are then going to respond to that with what we call the Counter-Reformation or the Catholic Reformation. But in either case, I think that the issue of the printing press is very, very important because had there been no printing press, my hunch is that there would have been no Protestant Reformation. In other words, that the Catholic Church would have remained united in Europe, at least through the 17th century, maybe the 18th century, and for all I knew, through the 21st century. But the printing press allowed Luther's sermons, and not only Luther's sermons, but the sermons of other of his sympathizers, to be spread throughout all of northern Germany, and then in a relatively short period of time into northern France, into Scandinavia, and eventually even into England itself. And so the printing press in some ways then I think makes the Reformation much more likely. These subversive ideas of Luther, subversive from the perspective of the Catholic Church, subversive from the perspective of the Vatican, are going to be widely distributed, and that could not have happened without the printing press.
Do you have time for one more question? Dr. Ostrower, was on this day in history that Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was shot and killed in New Delhi by her own bodyguards?
Well, I don't remember that quite as well. Yes, I do recall that it occurred. I don't know the details as why her bodyguards assassinated her. Indian politics has really been quite violent in the period since 1947. India received its independence from Britain in 1947. At the same time, Britain severed a portion from northwest India, which became Pakistan. Pakistan had a large Muslim population. India, of course, had a large, Hindu population. Although I might add, Brian, and this is not quite dealing with the question you're posing, that the number of Muslims who still live in India would represent about the second largest portion, the second largest population of Muslims in the entire world in any single country. But in any case, Indira Gandhi was assassinated. Her son was assassinated. There has been a tradition, if you will, of assassination in India that even goes beyond what we've had here in the United States. When President Lincoln and Garfield and McKinley were assassinated, President Kennedy, of course, was assassinated. So we've had to deal with this issue ourselves. But I think it's even been more of a problem for the Indian population.
We've been talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower. Have to leave it there. As always, Dr. Ostrower, thanks for joining us, and thanks for moving your schedule around this week.
No problem, and I'll talk to you guys next Tuesday.